They called it a rolling coffin, a death trap on tracks. American soldiers who crewed it gave it grim nicknames. Ronson, for the cigarette lighter slogan, lights first time, every time. Tommy Cooker, the British called it. German tank commanders supposedly laughed when they saw it coming. Their mighty Tiger tanks could destroy it from distances where this American tin can couldn't even scratch their paint. This was the M4 Sherman tank, the most produced tank of World War II, and according to popular history, one of the worst failures of the war. But what if everything you think you know about the Sherman tank is wrong? What if this so-called death trap was actually the single most important weapon that won the ground war in Europe? This is not just a story about steel and guns. This is a story about an idea, a radical American idea that flew in the face of centuries of military thinking. The idea was brutally simple. Quantity has a quality all its own. Welcome to part one of the true story of the Sherman tank, the weapon that shouldn't have worked, but did. Our story begins not on a battlefield, but in a boardroom in Detroit, Michigan. The year is 1940. France has just fallen in 6 weeks. The world watches in stunned horror as German panzer divisions, led by the legendary Desert Fox, Erwin Rommel, slice through Allied defenses with what seems like supernatural speed. The British Expeditionary Force has barely escaped at Dunkirk, leaving nearly all their tanks, trucks, and heavy equipment burning on the beaches. In Washington, D.C., American military planners watch the newsreels with growing, cold dread. They're not just watching a military defeat, they're witnessing a revolution in warfare. The German Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Fast-moving tanks supported by mobile infantry and dive bombers, breaking through lines, encircling entire armies, creating chaos faster than commanders can respond. And then the planners look at America's own tank force. The numbers are pathetic. The United States Army has fewer than 400 tanks. Most are light tanks like the M2, armed with nothing but machine guns. They're toys, golf carts with guns. Compared to the German Panzer IIIs and IVs rolling through Paris, America might as well be bringing knives to a gunfight. There's panic in the Pentagon corridors. They need tanks. Not hundreds. Thousands. And they need them yesterday. The man handed this impossible task is not a general. He's not a soldier at all. He's an industrialist. William Cygnus Knudsen, a Danish immigrant who rose to become president of General Motors. The U.S. government brings him to Washington and gives him a simple, terrifying order: outproduce the Nazis. Make more weapons than they can destroy. Knudsen looks at American industry and sees something the Germans, for all their engineering brilliance, don't have: Henry Ford's assembly line revolution. The ability to make complex machines not as individual crafts, but as flowing rivers of identical products. Knudsen becomes the chairman of the Office of Production Management. His first move is to gather America's automotive giants: Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, even the American Locomotive Company. He tells them to stop making cars and start making tanks. But there's a critical problem. They don't have a design to build. America's existing medium tank, the M3 Lee, is a stopgap disaster. It looks like a metal wedding cake, tall, ungainly, with its main 75mm gun mounted in a sponson on the right side of the hull, not in a rotating turret. This means to aim the main gun, the entire tank has to turn. It's a death sentence in tank combat. They need something new, something better. And they need the first one rolling off the line in months, not years. Enter the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. A team of sleep-deprived engineers works around the clock in secret. Their design parameters read like a list of contradictions. Make it reliable enough to drive from Normandy to Berlin without breaking down. Make it simple enough for an 18-year-old farm boy from Iowa to operate with minimal training. Make it cheap enough to produce 50,000 of them. And make it armed and armored well enough to fight German panzers. The lead designer, a quiet engineer named Harry Knox, makes a revolutionary decision: the cast hull. Instead of welding together dozens of individual steel plates, a slow, skilled process, they'll pour molten steel into massive molds, creating the entire front half of the tank in one solid, curved piece. It's stronger at the seams where tanks usually fail. It's dramatically faster to produce. and it gives the Sherman its distinctive, rounded nose that would become iconic. For the engine, they choose the Continental R975 radial engine, the same air-cooled engine used in crop dusters and civilian aircraft. It's not the most powerful engine available, but every mechanic in America knows how to fix it, and parts are everywhere. The gun selection is the 75mm M3, a medium-velocity gun good against infantry, machine gun nests, and light fortifications. And then comes the most controversial decision, the one that would haunt the Sherman forever, the armor thickness. At just 50mm on the frontal glacis plate, it's paper compared to the 100mm frontal armor of a German Tiger. The engineers know this. They have the reports from Europe. They make a conscious, calculated trade-off, protection for mobility and numbers. The Sherman will not be a lone knight in shining armor. It will be a soldier in an overwhelming army. This philosophical choice, written into the very blueprints, would define the Sherman's entire existence and become the source of its greatest legend and greatest criticism. Production begins in July 1941 at the Lima Locomotive Works in Ohio. The first M4 Sherman, serial number 1, rolls off the line. What happens next is nothing short of an industrial miracle unseen in human history. Factories that once made Buicks and Cadillacs transform into tank assembly lines. In Detroit, Chrysler's massive Dodge plant becomes the Detroit Tank Arsenal. They build it like they build cars. A moving assembly line where the tank chassis starts as a bare frame and gains parts as it moves down the line. Workers who once installed car seats now weld armor plate. At the peak of production in 1943, America is building one complete Sherman tank every 30 minutes. Let that sink in. Not every day, every 30 minutes. Day and night. 3 shifts. The numbers become staggering. The Fisher Body Division of General Motors builds over 10,000 Shermans. The Press Steel Car Company builds another 7,000. By war's end, the total will exceed 50,000 M4 Shermans of all variants. For comparison, Germany will build only 1,347 Tiger-IS and about 6,000 Panthers during the entire war. The math is brutal and beautiful in its simplicity. For every Tiger Germany produces, America produces 37 Shermans. This is Knudsen's vision made steel and smoke. This is the American way of war made manifest. Don't try to match the enemy weapon for weapon. Drown him in a flood of your own. But in late 1942, as the first Shermans are loaded onto transport ships bound for British forces fighting Rommel in the North African desert, the theory is about to meet the brutal, bloody reality of combat. The Sherman's baptism of fire comes at the Second Battle of El Alamein in October 1942. British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army, now equipped with hundreds of new Shermans supplied through the Lend-Lease program, faces Rommel's experienced Afrika Korps. The German Panzer IIIs and IVs are veterans of the desert. Their crews have been fighting for years. Their tactics are refined, deadly. The British tank crews, in contrast, are learning on the job. Many have only weeks of training. The battle opens with a massive artillery barrage, then the Shermans advance. Almost immediately, the reports start coming in. The Sherman's reliability in the harsh desert environment is a godsend. While German tanks suffer from sand clogging their complex air filters and precision engines, the Sherman's simple, rugged radial engine keeps going. Its mechanical simplicity means breakdowns can be fixed in the field with basic tools, a hammer, a wrench, some spare parts. A British maintenance officer writes in his report, "We can repair 3 Shermans in the time it takes to repair 1 Panzer IV. But then the Shermans encounter the newer German Panzer IV F2, armed with the long-barreled 75mm KWK 40 gun. The results are horrifying. British crews report German armor-piercing shells punching straight through the Sherman's 50mm frontal armor at combat ranges. Worse, when a shell penetrates, it often ignites the ammunition stored in sponsons along the tank's sides. The Sherman burns, and it burns fast. Crew survival rates in penetrated tanks are estimated at less than 20%. The British send urgent, desperate reports back to Washington. We need better armor. and we need a gun that can fight back at range. The Americans receive this feedback just as the Sherman is about to face its greatest, most terrible test, the invasion of Normandy and the hedge-maze killing grounds of the French Bocage country. The stage is set for the Sherman's darkest hour and the birth of its most persistent legend, the death trap myth. That story continues in Part 2. If the North African desert was the Sherman's baptism of fire, the Normandy Bocage would be its trial by hell, its Gethsemane of steel and flesh. D-Day, June 6, 1944. Dawn breaks over the English Channel not to birdsong, but to the thunderous roar of naval artillery and the screams of aircraft engines. As Allied infantry, weighed down by 60 pounds of gear, struggle through chest-deep water toward the bullet-swept beaches of France, a bizarre, almost surreal sight approaches from the sea. They look like strange, floating bathtubs with guns. Sherman duplex drive tanks, their tall canvas flotation screens making them appear like seafaring monsters, churn through the waves driven by twin rear propellers. This was Hobart's Funnies, the brainchild of the eccentric British Major General Percy Hobart. A tank that could swim. Many of these aquatic Shermans never make it. The rough channel swells overwhelm their canvas skirts. The seas are higher than anticipated. Tanks swamp, their engines choking on salt water, sinking like stones with crews trapped inside. But those that do claw their way onto the sand, emerging from the surf like armored amphibians, provide crucial, immediate fire support against the German machine gun nests and concrete pillboxes that are decimating the infantry. It's a moment of sheer ingenuity meeting desperate need. Once ashore, as the beachheads are secured, the Sherman settles into its destined role, the absolute, indispensable workhorse of the Allied advance through Western Europe. But beyond the dunes and sea walls, in the dense, ancient, almost living hedgerows of the French countryside, the Bocage, the Sherman is about to meet its mythic nemesis, the monster of its nightmares, the German Panther and Tiger tanks. The Normandy Bocage is a landscape seemingly designed by the devil to kill tanks. For centuries, Norman farmers have divided their fields with massive earthen banks called berms, topped with thick, tangled root systems and hedges that are often centuries old. These hedgerows are not decorative shrubs. They are living fortifications, some 15 feet high and just as thick. Fields are small, the size of tennis courts or football pitches. Roads are not roads but sunken lanes, carved deep into the earth by generations of cart wheels, forming perfect, deadly ambush corridors. Visibility is often less than 50 yards. There is no maneuvering room, no long, open vistas for gunnery. It is close-quarters combat in a green, claustrophobic maze. And in this lethal labyrinth, the Sherman's weaknesses are magnified tenfold, while its opponent's strengths become terrifyingly dominant. The cold, hard statistics from the gunnery ranges tell a story of near-hopeless imbalance. A Tiger Eye's legendary 88mm KWK-36 gun, adapted from the legendary flak anti-aircraft cannon, could punch through a Sherman's 50mm frontal armor from over 2,000 yards away, over a mile. At that range, the Sherman crew might not even see the Tiger that killed them. The Sherman's standard 75mm M3 gun, in contrast, needed to close to within 500 yards, point-blank range in tank warfare, to even hope to penetrate a Tiger's 100mm frontal glacis plate. Against the newer Panther tank, with its sloped 80mm frontal armor effectively equivalent to 140mm, the odds were even worse. In open country, it wasn't a fight, it was a methodical execution. But the Bocage was rarely open. It was a close-range brawl where the first shot usually decided everything. American tank crews, many experiencing combat for the first time, their hands slick with sweat inside their leather gloves, developed desperate, almost suicidal tactics born of sheer necessity. They called it swarming, or the wolf pack. One Sherman, its crew knowing their life expectancy was measured in minutes, would advance down a lane or attempt to bull through a hedgerow to draw the Tiger's fire and attention. While the Tiger was distracted, engaging this brave decoy, 2 or 3 other Shermans would try to flank around through adjacent fields or hidden farm tracks, hunting like predators for a shot at the Tiger's thinner side or rear armor. It was a tactic of sacrifice. The losses were catastrophic, seared into the memory of the armored divisions. In engagements like the notorious battle near the small town of Villers-Bocage, where German SS Obersturmführer Michael Wittmann single-handedly destroyed over a dozen Allied vehicles in minutes, entire Sherman companies were wiped out before they could even properly deploy. A young gunner from the U.S. 3rd Armored Division, his voice trembling decades later in an interview, recalled, "You'd see the bright orange flash from the German gun muzzle. Then you'd hear the whistle of the shell coming. Then the bang like the world ending as it hit. If it was a Tiger, that was usually it. The front of your buddy's tank would just disappear in a shower of sparks and metal. Then the fire would start, yellow and red, roaring up. The worst part was the screams on the radio. The screams from the guys who didn't get out fast enough. The psychological toll was immense, corrosive. Crews lived in constant, gut-churning fear of the brew-up, the catastrophic ammunition fire that could turn their steel home, their rolling fortress, into a crematorium in seconds. They watched their friends die in burning metal coffins. This was the Sherman's darkest hour, its valley of the shadow. The death trap legend wasn't born in newspaper headlines back home. It was forged in the blood, terror, and trauma of the men who crewed it in those Norman hedgerows in the summer of 1944. But this, and this is absolutely crucial to understand, is not the complete story. Because while the Shermans in Normandy were suffering this hell, the exact same tank was writing a completely different, triumphant narrative on the opposite side of the world, in a different war entirely. In the vast, brutal theater of the Pacific, fighting the fanatical infantry of the Imperial Japanese Army, the Sherman was proving to be a marvelously effective, even dominant, weapon. Japanese tanks, like the lightweight Type 95 Hago and the medium Type 97 Chiha, were smaller, more lightly armored, and armed with low-velocity 37mm or 57mm guns. Against them, the Sherman was a colossus, a king of the battlefield. Its 75mm gun could destroy any Japanese tank it encountered with ease, often from the front at ranges where the Japanese shells would simply bounce off the Sherman's armor. But the Sherman's role in the Pacific was more than just tank versus tank. Its reliability in the brutal jungle heat, monsoonal mud, and coral terrain was superior to any other tracked vehicle. American Marines and Army infantry came to rely on the Sherman not just as a tank, but as a multi-tool for survival and assault. They used them as mobile bulldozers to clear jungle paths for advancing troops. They used them as indirect artillery, firing high-explosive shells over ridges to destroy hidden Japanese bunkers. They used them as armored shields, advancing behind the tank's bulk while it absorbed machine gun and small arms fire during attacks on fortified positions. The tank's versatility, its mechanical simplicity, shone brightly in an environment where complex machinery usually failed. The Pacific War revealed a different dimension of the Sherman, not as a duelist, but as a supporter, a workhorse, a force multiplier for the infantry. This lesson was not lost on the engineers and planners back in the States. More importantly, even as the horror stories poured in from Normandy, the U.S. Army and its industrial partners were not static. They were learning, adapting, and improving at a pace that is astonishing even by today's standards. This is the second, often completely overlooked pillar of the American arsenal of democracy, the capacity for rapid, real-time adaptation. Feedback from the front lines, urgent, desperate, sometimes scribbled on notepaper by a battalion commander, went directly to engineers at the Tank Automotive Center in Detroit. Changes were implemented not for the next war, but for the tanks rolling off the assembly line next week. The most critical modification, born directly from the brew-up nightmare, was called wet stowage. The ammunition was physically removed from the vulnerable side sponsors, where a penetrating hit would turn them into instant infernos. Instead, the shells were moved to new, heavily protected bins located in the hull floor under the turret basket. These bins were surrounded by water-filled jackets. The logic was simple and brilliant. If an enemy shell penetrated the hull and hit the ammunition bin, the water would be released, dousing the propellant flames before they could engulf the tank. The effect was immediate and dramatic. Crew survival rates in penetrated tanks skyrocketed. A hit no longer meant an automatic death sentence. Next came the hardware upgrade every tank crew in Europe was praying for: the 76mm M1 high-velocity gun. This new gun, with its significantly longer barrel and more powerful shell, could finally punch through a Tiger's frontal armor at 1,000 yards and a Panther's at 500. It wasn't a magic wand. The German tanks were still deadly, but it gave Sherman crews a fighting chance, a reason to close the distance other than martyrdom. Not all Shermans received the 76mm gun. Retooling production lines took time, and the 75mm was still effective against most targets. But by the fall of 1944, enough 76mm armed Shermans were reaching the front to change the tactical calculus. Then came the ultimate evolution of the breed, the M4A3E8, nicknamed the Easy 8 by its crews. This variant featured a superior horizontal volute spring suspension, HVSS, that gave a much smoother ride over rough terrain and reduced maintenance. It had wider tracks that lowered ground pressure, allowing it to navigate mud that would immobilize earlier models. And it was armed with the 76mm gun. The Easy 8 was not a Tiger killer in a chivalrous one-on-one duel, but it was a fast, reliable, well-armed medium tank that could hold its own in the brutal endgame of the European War. The Sherman was evolving before the enemy's eyes, adapting in real time to the war it was actually fighting, not the war it had been designed for 3 years earlier. However, to judge the M4 Sherman's success or failure solely by its ability to win one-on-one duels against German heavy tanks is to profoundly miss its entire strategic purpose. That was never its job. The Sherman was designed from the ground up to be the backbone of a massive, mobile army, not its champion gladiator. Its purpose was ubiquity. It was meant to be everywhere at once, to provide immediate, responsive, mobile fire support to the infantrymen in the foxhole, to exploit breakthroughs not with a single, glorious charge of invincible heavy tanks, but with 100 smaller penetrations along a 50-mile front, each by a company of Sherman's supporting riflemen. To be so numerous, so replaceable, that losing a battalion of 50 tanks was a severe tactical setback to be absorbed and replaced, not a catastrophic strategic defeat that halted an entire army group's offensive. This philosophy was put to its ultimate test when General George S. Patton's audacious Third Army finally exploded out of the Normandy bocage in late July 1944 during Operation Cobra. What followed was Patton's legendary, high-speed race across France. And the vehicle that made it possible was the Sherman. Its mechanical reliability and strategic endurance were the keys to Patton's American-style blitzkrieg. While German Panther and Tiger divisions, for all their fearsome power, were constantly stalled, waiting for scarce fuel shipments, waiting for specialized spare parts for their over-engineered, finicky transmission systems, waiting for recovery vehicles strong enough to tow their immense weight. Patton's Shermans were covering 60, 70, even 80 miles a day. They broke down, yes, but they were repaired at the roadside by crews using parts cannibalized from other knocked-out or broken-down Shermans. They ran on any grade of gasoline they could capture from German dumps or scrounge from French farms. They kept moving. This was the Sherman's ultimate, war-winning triumph. Operational mobility and strategic endurance on a scale the Germans could not match. The Sherman won the war in Western Europe not necessarily by winning every head-to-head battle, though it won many, but by being present, functional, and fighting in every battle, every single day, from the beaches of Normandy to the banks of the Rhine River in Germany. It out-logisticized the enemy. It outlasted them. It was always there. By the time the Allied armies crossed into Germany itself in the bitter winter and spring of 1945, the Sherman had undergone another transformation in the eyes of many who fought in and alongside it. It was no longer just a tank. It was a symbol, an icon. a rolling, clanking, diesel-fumed embodiment of the phrase, the arsenal of democracy. Every Sherman that fought represented the immense, unstoppable productive power of the American home front. It was a product of thousands of workers, men, and, crucially, millions of women, Rosie the Riveter, in factories stretching from the Great Lakes to the Atlantic seaboard. It carried within its steel hull the collective will, the industrial muscle, and the democratic hope of a nation mobilized for total war. The final, and perhaps most telling, chapter of the Sherman story is what happened after the guns finally fell silent in 1945. The Sherman didn't retire. It couldn't. There were simply too many of them, a vast surplus of democracy's weapon. It became the foundational tank of the newborn Israeli Defense Forces, where it was modified, upgunned, and re-engined to become the M50 and M51 Super Shermans, fighting with distinction in the 1948, 1956, and 1967 wars, even defeating more modern Soviet tanks. It served as America's primary battle tank in the early, desperate months of the Korean War, where upgunned EZ-8s fought the Soviet-made T-34/85, itself a design influenced by the Sherman, to a bloody standstill. It served in the armies of dozens of countries around the globe, from Argentina to Pakistan, for decades after World War II ended. No other tank in the history of armored warfare has had such a long, varied, globally influential, and combat-proven service life. It was the tank that refused to fade away. So, we return to the haunting, central question that has shadowed this machine for 80 years. Was the M4 Sherman a death trap or a war winner? The uncomfortable, profoundly human truth is that it was both, and simultaneously neither. It was a weapon conceived for a very specific kind of war, a war of industrial production, of global logistics, of overwhelming material superiority. It embodied a cold calculus. It sacrificed a degree of individual crew survival to guarantee the survival and success of the Army as a whole. It was, in a deep sense, a democratic weapon. It was not built for an elite corps of aristocratic panzer aces, but for millions of citizen soldiers, farmers, mechanics, students, who needed a machine that was simple to operate, easy to maintain, and overwhelmingly present. Its legacy is complex, layered with pain and triumph, and profoundly revealing of the nature of modern industrial war. The Sherman tank forces us to remember that in the brutal arithmetic of total war, there are rarely perfect weapons, only difficult, tragic choices between competing, terrible necessities. The Sherman made its choice. It chose to be common. It chose to be reliable. It chose to be the tank that was always there, in overwhelming, undeniable numbers, when and where it was needed most. And in the final, decisive accounting of history, that choice, flawed, human, controversial, and costly, may have been the exact, essential ingredient that helped to save the free world from tyranny. This is the complete, unvarnished story of the M4 Sherman tank. Remember it not merely for its weaknesses, but for the impossible burden it was asked to carry, and for the liberated world it helped, against all odds, to create. If this deep dive into the complex truth behind a legendary machine has given you a new perspective, then you understand why this channel exists. We chase the complicated stories, the ones without easy answers. If you want to support this mission to bring nuanced history to light, you have real power. First, take a second to smash that like button right now. It tells YouTube's algorithm that content like this, thoughtful, researched, challenging, deserves to be shared far and wide. Second, make sure you're subscribed and that bell icon is turned on. We have already begun deep research on our next documentary, which will explore another World War II innovation that secretly shaped our modern world. Third, and most importantly, join the conversation below. In the comments section, tell us, knowing what you know now, was the Sherman's design philosophy of quantity over quality justified? What's the right balance in warfare? Your thoughts and debates are what make this community more than just a channel. They make it a place for learning. From the bottom of my heart, thank you for your time, your curiosity, and for valuing history in all its difficult, essential complexity.